Welcome, everybody. We're just going to, right at the top of this session, do a bit of positioning. Back in 2013, a large merchant turning over a couple of billion in card payments, Shop Direct, Very, you'll know it as, became the first merchant globally not to have cardholder data in their environment. They became the first merchant, if you like, to do that. And it was on the back of that, supported by a payments membership group, Vendorcom, Jeremy at the PCI Council, and lots of other people contributing. I got invited to pull together a group that now produced what is now the guidance on the applicability of the PCI DSS to contact centers in the supply chain. So that's a document that we'll be referencing through this session, protecting telephone-based payment card data. One of the reasons I was absolutely passionate about getting that project across the line was that contact centers are changing, and that the card brands and the whole payments community had seen that with the rollout of chip and PIN, the whole retail piece, the whole face-to-face payment channel had become more secure, and that fraud was moving onto the internet. And that happening was just going to happen, what I thought, in the same way for the Moto channel, for the mail order telephone order channel, which is where contact center sits. That as contact centers went to the cloud and the internet became more secure, so fraud would move more towards hosted contact centers as they became or transitioned to the cloud. And, you know, weren't ever going to be again lots of tin boxes connected to lots of copper wires, you know, behind loads and loads of locked doors. It just wasn't going to be like that. It was just going to be as the high street and the back street had moved to online, so call centers would go to online. So it's on the back of that that I want to be able to introduce three friends from the payment card industry who've been a great support all along to securing the Moto channel. So firstly, Candice. Hi, Candice.
Hello.
Hi, Candice from Elevon. And Candice today is going to take not just the role of the acquirer, but really champion the merchant and help you understand where the merchant's coming from in our conversation. Welcome to Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello there.
Hi. Jeremy's going to look at and represent the PCI Council's view, which is very much about the intent of the standard. What's the standard trying to achieve, and what's the guidance there to achieve? How do we get that message across? And finally, Simon from BT.
Hi there.
Hi, Simon.
Thanks for inviting me, John.
You're very welcome, very welcome. And Simon's going to look after the technical bit for us. Simon's the lead QSA, perhaps the person I've always worked with most in this space. And Simon's able to view it from 2 points of view, which is great. First of all, BT as a very large merchant, but also BT as a third-party service provider. So let's get straight off to it. Let's start off with some positioning in the ecosystem. And for the audience, that's exhibits 1 to 6 that we're looking at, slides 1 to 6. Candice, kick us off with the acquirer's position and the relationship between the acquirers, the card brands, and the merchants. Just give us a feel for that.
Okay, so merchants are contracted to me, as acquirers, and we in turn are contracted with the brands to comply with their various compliance programs that mandate that our merchants need to be secure and PCI compliant. I report the merchant compliance status to the brands throughout the year. And if unfortunately a data breach happens, the brands work with us to assess the situation with our merchants and pass us on the fees. I won't call them fines because it's contractually obligated to the card brands, which we then need to pass back to our merchants. And obviously the point of the presentation here is to position really where third parties sit in our merchants space. So if we get past the scheme fees, brand fees, we then need to pass them to merchants who then, under third-party service provider governance programs, will need to seek some sort of recourse there.
Good one. Simon, just pick up QSA role. Where does the QSA sit in all of this?
So I guess most QSAs like myself can talk for England, so really we're one of those professional kind of advice and guidance type representatives. So our role is to understand the actual PCI standard and its interpretation to all people, processes, technologies, etc., and really be the go-between between the merchant and the service providers and the acquirers themselves. So whilst we test the PCI standard against the merchant or a service provider, we also need to understand the relationship with the payment processing, and also if there are any merchants. So for example, some large merchants have specific requirements pushed down from their acquirers, then we either test against, well, not either, we test against the standard, but also taking considerations that any acquirers may request a merchant to focus on a particular area. So for example, contact centers, because that's a higher risk than there are around one of their other business processes. So really, we're kind of the interface between the council and the standard, the merchants and their acquirers, and just making sure that we're testing and applying the standard appropriately, whilst providing the merchants the requirements to provide the compliance or non-compliance to the acquirers.
And do you get involved? I was just going to ask, do you get involved with third-party service providers on behalf of the merchant as well?
Yeah. So obviously part of the role of the QSA is to assess the environment. So not just one particular service provider, but the end-to-end journey that the merchant's taking, and understand how those service providers fit into that journey. Because we're going to discuss later on, but when we talk about cloud-based providers, one of the assumptions is that these providers may be out of scope for PCI because they're a carrier or they're telephony based. So yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot more nowadays, especially within BT, as a service provider, people wanting to pass the liability, well, not pass the liability, but pass the scope over to external service providers to remove them and try and ease the burden for compliance.
Got it. Jeremy, give us a feel for the PCI Council and its function and what it wants to achieve.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much. So for those following on the slides, I've gone on to slide, which is point 2. We are a global standards body. That's our role in life. We are there to write standards, programs, guidance documents that protect cardholder payment, however and wherever it's used in any process, any type of transaction. So that's our main role. We are all about protecting the cardholder data. And it's a very different role to that by Candice and Simon, that they are doing the compliance related aspects. We're not involved in the compliance related aspects of payments. We're really focused on providing the payment standards that organizations can evaluate and assess themselves against to ensure they're protecting their customers' data. And when you go on to number 3, when you look at the 4 pillars of activity, how do we do that? We're doing a lot of participation and outreach, make sure that people are aware of what they're expected to do. That's why we're on the call today. We're also constantly looking at how can we ensure we're providing the right standards for all of the different payment options. And sometimes, as in the case with the call centers, it needs sort of more guidance than additional requirements. For general payments, the PCI data security standard is the de facto standard for protecting cardholder data. But in those instances, then we're looking at, well, what additional guidance can we provide for certain circumstances? And the contact center and the call centers are a very specific set of circumstances. And so we've worked with the industry now for quite some time to be able to produce some guidance there. Number 4, essentially, we're not just the DSS, so we protect the card data throughout its entire journey, however it's used. We've got standards that cover the generation of cards through to the generation of PIN, through to the generation of data, all the way through. However you do it, whatever you do with it, it's generally got a PCI standard there to be able to provide it. Just looking at the DSS in particular, on number 5, this is a standard we first introduced back in 2006. And just like payments haven't stayed the same and haven't stood still, neither has the standard. So as payments, as technologies evolve, we've had to update and change and modify the standards. And so we've been doing that ever since. Our latest version of DSS, number 4, that's just about to come out. That's going to be released for public consumption in March this year, so not long to wait now. And that's really taking us into the next decade of protecting payment data with the techniques available. The two on the top really give you an idea that we've been involved in trying to protect cardholder payments in a call center for quite some time. You know, we released our first guidance document back in 2011. We worked with the community then. And then as John said, the community came to me and said, Jeremy, you're falling behind with technology here. We need to update this document. And thanks to John and many others, they actually went through, updated the document, and the one available now is what's the latest version. And it's really, it's been a document designed by you to be used by you. So it's full of really useful information.
Good, thanks for that, Jeremy. One thing I want to move on now is the card brands are under pressure from other payment mechanics, account-to-account payments being one, using direct-to-bank payments, right? But I'm also interested to look at the promise the card schemes make, the promise the card schemes make to always reimburse the customer's safe. So it's critical for them to keep card data safe through the standard, as you've explained, Jeremy. But I'm interested to explore the link to wider data protection. Where does the PCI DSS sit against the wider data protection regulations, right? So Candice, can you just give us what's the merchant's position here legally, right? When it comes to not just card data, but card data as personal data.
So, okay, so there is a really big link to payment card data security standard compliance and general data protection regulation obligations around personal data, because payment card data is personal data. So it's going to be firmly on the radar for INEA payment security programs, but also for the data protection officer. There are requirements in the GDPR around security of processing that a merchant and indeed a processor have to have in place, and they call out specifically that PCI DSS is a really great framework to evidence compliance with the GDPR. Processors, so third-party service providers, are really in scope of that legislation, and also the third-party service provider governance, having written agreements in place, which is obviously under 12.8 and 12.9 of the PCI standards, where it's required to be very clear on what you're outsourcing, who's responsible for what, and to be very clear through network diagrams or and documented in compliance validations who is doing what. So in the event of a data breach, when the investigation comes, not only from card schemes but from a data protection authority, that the merchant can evidence and also work with their third party to show that they had a proper governance framework in place.
And I think we've got an exhibit, haven't we? Exhibit 11. It looks at requirement 12.8 that gives us some detail here. Simon, do you want to pick that up for us? Requirement 12.8 and how you look to apply that?
No, that's fine. And again, so 12.8 from a merchant's perspective is all about making sure that you understand your end-to-end customer journey. Okay, it's not just about the technology and the people, it's about the end-to-end journey. So really where we're looking to outsource a solution, so for example the cloud provider for telephony, it's all about understanding what it is that the service provider does for you even. So in terms of understanding the actual service they're delivering in terms of your scope. And 12.8 really has got multiple areas. So, one of the key lists being ensure you have a list of service providers and you track and maintain their list of AOCs. You know, so making sure they are compliant on a regular basis, because they all don't start on the 1st of January and finish on the last day of December. Also making sure that we've got contractual obligations within the contract as well. So, you know, for me as a merchant and a service provider, it's both having the contractual wording that thou shalt protect the payment data, well, the personal data, which will class as credit card data, but also what is it the service providers do for you. So make sure you have a responsibility matrix. And I like to remind people that, you know, the two go hand in hand. Ideally, your written statement will refer to a responsibility matrix, which nails down every single PCI requirement and exactly what happens. And then obviously ensure you monitor that on an annual basis, because it's an ever evolving. You know, as a merchant, I've got 80 service providers that we track internally, and it is, you know, a big effort. So when you look at some of the other items on there, like item 10 about the third-party assurance, it's good to have a big, you know, a clear program about how you're maintaining those service providers.
I just want to make really clear now about the definition of a third-party service provider, because meeting that definition really says whether or not the PCI DSS applies, right? So the definition's clear if you store, process, or transmit, but let's expand a little on impact the security of, right? Candice, can you just give us a feel for what you'd understand to be understanding the impact of the security of?
So it really, where any third party has access to payment data, so spoken word or unspoken paper, they can materially affect the security of that entity's environment. So where we encourage our merchants to reduce the footprint of their payment security obligations, to outsource wholly to benefit from the minimum requirements they can have applied to them. That's where as Simon alludes to, is understanding the full scope and all the different touch points where the merchant believes they have completely outsourced, because it comes back to that they are on the contract to me to demonstrate PCI compliance, but they've wholly outsourced and they've listed the third party within their validation documentation as discharging their PCI compliance obligations. So it's really clear and important, as Simon mentioned, to have responsibilities matrices and the current valid documentation third parties.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Candice. So let's just take an example for clarity. Let's say I contract with a merchant as a third party, but I myself as a third party have outsourced to another third party, right? I'm managing the contract with my third party. Do I need to be validated as a PCI compliant service provider?
So the merchant will have the contract with the third party, who in turn has a fourth party. So the third party will be responsible for having an attestation of compliance that includes that fourth party within their scope.
Got it. Simon, do you come across this a lot?
All the time, Jeremy.
Yeah.
You know, within our 80 odd service providers that we maintain, we actually track fourth parties as well. So not only do we track the third parties, we track the fourth parties, because obviously one of the things at BT, obviously, you know, we want to make sure we protect the customer's data, because it's the BT's brand at risk. So whether we've wholly outsourced that to a third party, or we've outsourced it to a fourth or a fifth party, then my role as the QSA internally is to make sure I understand what the full end-to-end service is. So, you know, personally as a QSA, this is one thing we need for the standard, is to uplift, to ensure that we know again, I go back to the full end-to-end journey and understand what it is for everybody, because at the end of the day, if there is a data breach, you know, it comes down to contractuals and liabilities, but it's mainly the brand impact for me. I want to protect the brand, therefore, you know, I'm going to make sure we know the third, fourth and fifth parties. So definitely you need to understand that.
Got it.
If I may jump in, John, just on this, because there is one key aspect here. When you're using the word fully outsourced, and fully outsourced means that you as an organization do nothing with it. It's another person who's doing that. And there's a difference between an organization running a website or running it, and then I like to say passing over. So let's say, all right, because I get a lot of people coming to me and say, I don't touch payment, so I'm not in scope now. Well, unfortunately, you are if you're managing the website and then going across to the third party, because one of the things that we see is the criminals have got very adept at attacking that interface between you and your third party provider. So how you transfer across to that third party provider, whether you do a direct post, whether you do an iframe, whether you use JavaScript, all of those have an impact. And from a PCI perspective, we are expecting you to be able to look after your side of that. You may not have any card data, but we're still expecting you to have good levels of security around that transition process as well. So if you are, the word fully outsourced means fully outsourced. You're doing nothing with that website. You're not touching it.
And that's picked up through the SAQs, isn't it? Because
yes,
we're referring here to SAQA.
Yeah.
And we put in one of the exhibits around the 14A about the qualification criteria.
And that's very important.
Super important. So what it means is that if you're a merchant and you want to minimize your data footprint, completely outsource everything, you can only do that to a validated third-party service provider, which means having an attestation of compliance.
Right. And if you are using one of those methods I said, where if you're transferring across using an iframe, then we have SAQA IP that is a different set that gives you slightly more requirements, but covers that situation when you're doing a bit, but you're not seeing any of the payment data. So the options are there. So do go on our website and have a look at that. But yes, but you do need to know which it is very important to know which self-assessment questionnaire, if you are applicable for that, you can fill in. And Simon, I don't know if you're more of an expert of the SAQ area than me.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on that comment bit about fully outsourced in the contact center remit, to bring it back to that, one of the things I see quite often, from a service provider arm is people looking to contract to fully outsource, and we have to remind people that you don't fully outsource your obligations. As a merchant, you are obligated to ensure the end-to-end journeys. So whilst you might outsource to a cloud-based provider and they might have an SAQ, you've got to think about things like SIP refers. So when we get into the real depth and the techie bits, it is actually that handoff from one SBC to another SBC. If you're doing call routing, and depending on the conversation, the way the call routes, and technically you could be bringing yourself as a merchant back into scope. So again, on your point, Jeremy, not only on the iframe and the SAQAs, if you're trying to apply an SAQA to a contact center environment and you are outsourcing to a compliant third party, then the details and the details there, and it really matters. And as a reminder, Jeremy, John, SAQAs is what Jeremy says, fully outsourced, and it's proving that fully outsourced, because technically you're never fully outsourcing. You're always responsible for the end-to-end journeys, therefore making sure you're using compliant third parties, and that's what we'll report to Candice. As a merchant, I've outsourced using DTMF masking. However, I understand my end-to-end journeys and they are fully documented, and I know what's happening. So yeah,
and just picking up on, because that looks at the merchant perspective, but let's look at the third-party service provider perspective. So in scope, transmitting card data, which is spoken card data, so the agent can hear it, but they can't use any SAQ, can they, Simon? No. So just talk about the compliance journey, which SAQ a third party should use, and what's their approach to it, even if they outsource to the fourth party.
Yeah, so for service providers, they're always completing a ROC. I mean, I've seen some service providers where they're providing an SAQD. Now, obviously, that depends on this level of service they provide, whether a level 1 or a level 2. But then there's different occurrences. So personally, I prefer to make sure that people have a ROC, so they do the full SAQD as it was, but they select potentially the responsibilities for their solution. So I always encourage merchants, when looking at service providers, AOCs, to make sure that it's for the service they provide, because it's not always. And you can really tell when you look at the in scope requirements, is it just requirement 12.8 where they've outsourced it to a fourth party, or is it following the lines of for example, the SAQC, where there's no storage of cardholder data but they've called in the others? So there is kind of an accepted practice at the moment, whether it's right or wrong, to, select the SAQ-C or the SAQ-D or the SAQ-A, but within the ROC reporting template. So it's definitely important that, you check what your service providers are providing to you.
I'm just mindful of time now. Let's quickly look at some detail, Simon, right? Look at exhibits 18 to 21, where we're really getting into these demarcation points, right? Between a merchant and a third-party service provider, and perhaps a third-party service provider to their fourth party, yeah, which might be a DTMF clamping provider or a digital provider. What's just give us a feel for the things that you're checking, and when does a UCAS or CCAS vendor come into scope of PCI?
Yeah, so one of the things I love about my job, all right, is not only am I a QSA, I'm representing us as a merchant for BT. BT is a service provider, and we're also a carrier network. All right. So in terms of contact centers and as a service provider, one of the things I see a lot is people classifying UCAS or CCAS as carrier networks. So of course, and this just comes down to, I think personally, a lack of education or a lack of scope and awareness. So it is quite important that, we understand our roles. So, the merchant is always responsible for the end-to-end journey and understanding those. If you outsource to a cloud provider, there's always the scenarios where, there is going to be chargebacks and refunds. So even if you do have a call center taking your calls, who are cloud hosted, they do need to have compliance. Take, for example, pause and resume. Pause and resume doesn't negate the need for compliance, right? Pause and resume negates the need for encryption of cardholder data. The full scope of this cloud service provider is definitely in scope for transmission and processing and impacting the security of the card data. So we need to understand, what is it from a merchant scope. If we move on to a telco, so let's start at the very bottom, right? So the telco, the carrier, is the lines and the connections, the MPLS or the private connections between organizations. So when you're connecting to a carrier, that's generally over the internet again. So we need to be very clear the differentiator between a carrier network and, a communications company and a telco. So in order to, de-scope and this way, as a service provider, BT, we do the lines as well as the contact centers, including the DTMF masking. So just separating out the three entities or the three areas of the service provider. So the carrier is out of scope. So let's define what it is they do, the lines in the ground going into the buildings. Look at the telecommunication companies. So that's your UCAS kind of providers, and they are in scope for PCI of the processing payment data on there. And then you've got the contact centers where we've got the pause and resume. So again, not only should your AOC be compliant for the pause and resume, but also the other activities about the SBCs and the other technical components which people forget about. So I mean, in a summary, that's the different levels of differentiator between those. And as a QSA, especially in scoping with bids within the global organization at BT, I do see people getting confused, and even people putting in requests for bids for compliance services, not really understanding the details of what there is.
No, thanks for that. So let's quickly go back and take a look at the technology, and the technology is able to reduce scope and able to support an SAQA approach, which for the audience, we're looking at exhibits 22 to 25 now. Simon was covering 18 to 21, but Jeremy, there's a lot of talk about pause resume when we're putting the guidance together, right? And a lot of confusion out there. Just give us a feel for how we approached it in the guidance.
No, absolutely. It's probably worthwhile just giving you a bit of history on pause and resume anyway. So the reason a lot of organizations and call centers are recording the call is that the area they're involved in, the financial authority have said, you must record that call for confirmation that this person said, yes, I want to take out this service. And so they said, you've got to record the entire call. So this is going back to my early days at PCI, 2010-ish, when we got in touch with them and said, really, we don't want to record the cardholder data. We don't need that recorded. And the financial authority said, no, we don't need that. We just need to know that the person has taken out the service. And so that is when people went, okay, we'll stop the call. We'll stop recording during the card data being entered and then resume the call afterwards. And we were like, great, that's one way of doing it. Now, from a data security perspective, then the diagram 5 is really good because it shows you that the call center is far much more than just the pause and resume. There are so many more areas where cardholder data is coming in that you need to be aware of. So not having the cardholder stored in the pause and resume is good. How effective that is, as in, is that pause and resume recording full of toxic data? Probably yes. You know, have you got confidence that there is no card data in there? Best I've heard is it's about 10% that you'll get card data still into it. So you've got to be aware of it. So pause and resume is one solution. And as a council, we go, okay, that's it. But the rest of your call center, as in diagram on probably 23, is still in scope. And there's probably quite a bit in scope of that call and record data. So it's really understanding as an organization, if you're in a call center, managing card data is understanding where it could go, understanding where it is going, checking and making it secure and compliant with the standard wherever you touch it. So you can see, I like also the gray box outside it, which says basically you can't control what's coming into you, but as soon as it gets to you, as soon as it's into you, you're in control and you've got to be protecting that customer's data.
Got it. So in the guidance, we looked at an approach to this, didn't we, on Appendix C, right? Which you can see in those exhibits there. We're looking at A and B as part of the diagram. But it was about organizations making choices from a merchant point of view, making a choice if they can outsource or do it in-house. If they do it outsource, obviously, and taking payments, they've got to be able to make sure that the outsourcer is certified and validated PCI compliant. But of course, if you're making the decision yourself, then you can choose to secure all the data all the time, part of the data all the time, which is through segmentation, or as he said, Jeremy, pause, resume, or you can deploy technology that's going to take it out of scope, yeah, and not going to allow spoken cardholder data into the environment. So we classify
just on that, just before we go on, because that is a key point, by the way.
Yeah.
The DTMF suppression, that removing the cardholder data is not just beneficial in terms of knowing that you've got no cardholder data in your call recording. It also starts to cover other requirements around being able to see and also being able to record the cardholder data. As a call center, you're expected to make sure the agents aren't recording cardholder data. So if they're receiving the full PAN through their earpiece, we know of situations where the criminals have either bribed or coerced call center staff to write it down. We know there are techniques where literally the police have arrested someone with a little notebook of all the PANs that they've recorded during the day. We know there's other technologies. So it's getting rid of that data so the agent can't hear it, takes the agent into a much better place from being able to protect your staff. So your staff now can't get access to that data. So they're protected, so they can't be bribed or coerced. It makes their working environment better because now you're not worried about what are they bringing in, because if they had a mobile phone, they could be doing all sorts with the data. So getting rid of the data before it gets to the agent and letting the agent just see the last 4 digits to confirm it has a lot of benefits of improving security, but improving the working environment of the agents as well.
And particularly true in working from home.
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. With more and more people working from home, ensuring that, you know, the home work is not exposed to it is really, you know, it's very important. So masking that data so they never hear it, excellent way forward.
And Appendix C looks at these technologies for those that are attended, i.e. agent and customer in constant voice contact, or unattended, IVR, automated, all the things we're used to, press 1, press 2. But then the classification breaks down into telephony, you mentioned DTMF, but also digital. And a question for Simon, I think, is, Simon, are we seeing more digital first approaches these days, or are we playing catch up?
I think we're still playing catch up, John. I mean, obviously, from a BT perspective, we've moved on to the digital and the DTMF, and obviously, just a reminder to everybody out there that DTMF isn't the golden nugget either, because there are always those customers. So, for example, we've got a regulatory obligation. I can't even say it today, where we do have customers who can't use DTMF for whatever reason. So there is still a percentage of customers who handle that. So what do? Moving back to your Appendix C, it talks about digital telephony. Then what I'm seeing in terms of the global businesses, there is a big move in organizations moving towards digital channels, and the big driver for moving to digital is the fact that especially large organizations, they've got this legacy telephony equipment, okay, which can't meet the data security standards. So not only PCI but just best practice, because that's what PCI is, isn't it? It's best practice.
Yeah.
So in terms of vulnerabilities, while VoIP might be a kind of one of those early, people aren't compromising and they're not exploiting it yet, then obviously the move from in-house telephony to cloud-based digital telephony is definitely on the big. We've got a lot of large merchants who are moving that way because they've got global contact centers. So the idea of having a cloud-based digital platform is you can just follow the sun models for whatever it is they're doing. But yeah, and again, PCI doesn't say you can't do something, right? So the business is going to be the driver of how they want to take card. It's all about customer experience. Then obviously it's our role from a QSA and a technical point to support the business in making sure we have we consider both the business and the security standard itself and protect them. So digital is definitely the way forward, because we're integrating things like chat, solutions as well. We're doing pay by link, for example, where we want, we've got a customer who can't pay using DTMF. Let's send them a link via SMS or via email. And digital is the way forward to, kind of mitigate the legacy issues where they can't patch or they can't encrypt, move it to digital to integrate with other customer journeys. Because seeing COVID, one of the things I've seen a lot over COVID is we talked about working from home. We've got retail, we've got contact centers, and large businesses are merging them all into one, really. There isn't really a traditional contact center model anymore. So digital is definitely on the up.
Yeah, and I think with digital, the technologies that are around these days can offer that digital and attended option, which means that you can guide the customer through it. I was reading some Ofcom stats from their latest report on connectivity, and I think 12 to 13% of the UK population is not connected to the internet, which means that a vast percentage are. So I think we should see some progress. Candice, one final point before we sum up. Just in terms of UCaaS and CCaaS providers offering a marketplace, what are the watchwords here from the merchant's perspective? What should the merchant be looking out for with their third-party service providers?
So I think clearly, as it's been outlined, the scope and understanding what the third party is going to be undertaking within that merchant's scope, and clarifying it within requirements matrices, and using those as annexes within a third party service provider contract. But firstly, the scope being really clear is very important, because that will dictate the making sure that what's in the validation documentation that they would need to rely upon for their validation documentation with me as an acquirer fully covers the scope of that service. So our merchants using any such technology, CCaaS and UCaaS, who control the integration and routing of calls to the embedded third party as a level 1 service provider, would need to be, they'd need to check that the third party was PCI compliant, covering the scope of the requirements for the work they're undertaking for them, the scope of works, and that they're listed with the card scheme. So we would always tell our merchants, or we go through the validation documentation and we do check the third party. And if they're not listed with Visa, MasterCard, we have to push back because they can't be compliant by default. Got it.
That's and there is an exhibit on the Visa with a Visa logo on it that talks about 300,000 Visa transactions or MasterCard transactions. That's the threshold, isn't it? Below which a third party can self-attest using SAQ, DSP, but above that, then they need to be audited by a QSA.
Yes.
Got it. Got it. Okay, let's begin just to sum up. Jeremy, give us just a quick summary of advice to these third parties, our third-party service providers, whether they're UCaaS, CCaaS, or outsourced contact center.
So I have to say that if I was a merchant looking to use a third party and that third party didn't bring me in a fully signed off AOC, I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. So you're saying, yes, you can have a third party if you're below this level. Honest. If you're providing payment services, you should stand behind what you're doing, and you should be quite willing and happy to get the auditors in and get Simon in and do the assessment, because you want to make sure that your customers know that you treat payment security seriously, and nothing says that more than having a fully signed off ROC. For everyone else, get involved with the council. We need more involvement, become a participating organisation, go to our website, use our guidance documents. We have a lot of information, a lot of frequently asked questions there. So there's a lot of help on our website. So, there's a lot of help from around the community as well, but it's a way of ensuring that you're taking payment security seriously.
Candice, just give us a quick feel from a contractual point of view.
I'm just checking I wasn't on mute there, sorry. So from a contractual point of view, the merchant is obligated to be PCI compliant, but that is just a contractual obligation in some people's perspective, but it is actually a regulatory legislative obligation under GDPR to comply with the regulation. So for third parties, you have under PCI DSS 12.9 obligations to meet the merchant's 12.8 requirements around third-party service provider governance. But under GDPR, there's a whole Article 26 that covers the role of the processor. So the merchant will be a controller, but you could be a processor or a joint controller, depending on the scope of works you're doing. So you are joint and inseparably responsible. So I think it's really worth engaging and understanding the commitments, not only under PCI DSS, but under GDPR.
Got it. Thank you. Simon, give us a quick summary.
Yeah, a couple of points then. Just to remember that the merchant is always responsible for the end-to-end compliance journey, so you can't always fully outsource the service you're providing. Okay, the standard, again, make sure you get a QSA who understands the technology you're assessing. I've seen so many AOCs from third parties where they've just not understood the scope and the technology that needs to be reviewed. Back to what Candice and Jeremy were saying, make sure you get an AOC that covers that, i.e. in the executive summary, it does say we include the telephony, we do X, Y, and Z, and if not, challenge it and ask more question, right? The executive summary is just that, it won't include the detail, but ask for clarifications from those service providers to double check. And I'm also seeing a massive move from these UCaaS and CCaaS providers actually providing AOCs. And that's because there are more merchants going out and saying, I do need an AOC, yeah. And then when the QSAs are up, understanding the technology as well, with the council giving the telephony-based guidance, which helps significantly, then we are seeing a lot more QSAs understanding that and scoping it in. So I think we've still got a way to go, and hopefully version 4 will kind of support us on that journey with the new technologies. So yeah, just be aware, right? Service providers for UCaaS and CCaaS do need AOCs. The SAQAs, are great, but you are still, ultimately responsible as a merchant, and just make sure you've got people to support and guide you that understand what they're talking about.
And that's requirement 12, isn't it, Simon? That people really need to pay attention to. I've got a question here to quick. I know we're sort of out of time, but very quickly, call centers that are using virtual terminals, where the agent's hearing the contact, the card data, inputting it into a terminal, in scope or out of scope, Simon?
Well, the virtual terminals are in scope, and this is where I see a lot of confusion around what the virtual terminal SAQ is applicable to. If you've got a tablet on your corporate network, then you don't really meet the criteria for a virtual terminal. Yeah, it's got to be one at a time credit card going in. And I guess the whole thing around Moto is you know, moto fraud, in theory, the customer's got the card in front of them, they've got the CVV or the CV2 on the back. Therefore, that's kind of the part of the risk, you know, in the fraud section. E-commerce, yes, you've got the additional questions now that are required under the SCA. And for me, I see in moto, you know, and there is a lot more fraud, especially during COVID, coming into moto. So the CV2, and there is always going to be that risk, right? You know, and it's up to what do we do as part of our authentication processes, which are outside of PCI, you know. B2, we have to validate a customer before they take the payment and ask all of those questions. So by the time we get to make a payment, in theory, we're kind of, you know, almost there to know that they are the actual customer.
Yeah. So in scope, all of the infrastructure is in scope, the agent's in scope, the technology is in scope. Apply the appropriate the levels of
to that technology that's in scope. Yeah. So hopefully you've got a single VLAN or a connection, but again, it comes down to interpretation from a QSA, and there is a vast array of interpretation. So again, the merchant's responsibility is to make sure they've got the professionals who can guide them with the correct guidance.
Got it. JB, over to you.
Hi, thank you for that. It was very interesting and yeah, really insightful. So thanks to all the panelists and for John for sharing expertly. Just to bring you up to date with what we're going to do after this session. So we're going to send out an email. You'll receive an email in the next 24 hours, which will have information about this session, including the information from the polls, but also there will be a recording of the session. If you want to go back and re-listen, as you'll be able to do that, because obviously there's a lot of content that's been talked about. There'll be the slides will be included as well, and also some supporting information which has been provided from each of the panelists. If you do have any questions beyond that, please get in contact. John will help you as best he can, and obviously any of the other panelists as well. We're going to be pushing out a survey as well, so if you could fill out a survey in when you leave the session and just give us your feedback, that would be much appreciated, because it helps us deliver a better session moving forward, and also get a view of how you enjoyed it, or if you in the areas you have sort of found most interesting. So yeah, thank you for joining. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and we shall hopefully see you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.